The first time Ralph Weston saw Virginia Crawford, she was arguing with a mule, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was already in trouble. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Coulter's Creek, Texas, sat baking under a sun that had no patience for the living. The settlement was modest even by frontier standards: a general store, a livery, a saloon with a crooked sign, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a scatter of homesteads stretching out into the mesquite flats like seeds thrown carelessly from a careless hand. It was not the kind of place that drew men of ambition, but it was exactly the kind of place that held men of stubbornness, and Ralph Weston was nothing if not that. He had come to Coulter's Creek 6 months prior with 2 horses, a bedroll, a decent Winchester rifle, and a deed to 40 acres of dry, rocky land that most sensible men would have laughed at. The previous owner had been a man named Horace Tibbet, who had reportedly died of either snakebite or heartbreak, depending on who you asked and how much they'd had to drink. Ralph did not ask. He simply paid what was owed to the county clerk, shook the man's hand, and rode out to his new land to see what he'd gotten himself into. What he'd gotten himself into was substantial work and a stubborn hopefulness that refused to quit. By the time spring arrived, Ralph had cleared a quarter of the acreage, built a modest but solid 2-room cabin from cedar and limestone, sunk a well that actually gave water, and begun fencing his pasture with enough post holes to have given an ordinary man a permanent hunch. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean from honest labor, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck when he sweated and gray eyes that seemed to take in more than he ever said aloud. He was quiet the way deep water is quiet, not because there was nothing there, but because there was a great deal, and it had simply learned to be still. The day he first laid eyes on Virginia Crawford, he had ridden into town for nails and flour and come out of Peterson's general store to find a scene that would have made a painter give up his brushes in frustration, because no canvas could hold it. Virginia Crawford stood beside a large, gray, thoroughly unimpressed mule in the middle of the main street, her hands on her hips, her dark hair partially escaped from its pins in the afternoon heat, and her expression one of magnificent, barely controlled fury. The mule had planted itself and was refusing to move a single step toward the wagon it was meant to be hitched to. A small crowd of townspeople had arranged themselves at a respectful distance, watching with the particular appreciation that Texans reserve for good entertainment. "You move this instant," Virginia was saying to the mule, with the measured authority of a woman who did not raise her voice because she did not need to. "I have 3 miles to cover before dark, and I have exactly no patience left for your opinion about it." The mule blinked at her. A fly landed on its ear and was ignored. "I am going to count to 3, Virginia continued, "and you are going to choose what happens next." She counted to 3. Nothing happened except that the mule exhaled heavily through its nose with what sounded almost like contempt. Ralph set down his purchases against the hitching rail, walked to the mule's head, took hold of the bridle with one steady hand, and spoke quietly into the animal's ear. Something he said, or perhaps simply the confidence with which he said it, seemed to communicate itself to the creature, because it took 2 reluctant steps forward, and then stood in proper hitching position with the resigned air of a subject acknowledging a superior. Virginia Crawford turned to look at Ralph Weston with dark eyes that were equal parts surprised, grateful, and deeply suspicious of both those things. "You speak mule," she said. "It helps to be polite," Ralph said. She stared at him a moment longer. She was perhaps 24 or 25, he guessed, with the kind of face that was not classically pretty so much as it was intensely, arrestingly alive, a strong jaw, a wide mouth, eyes the color of good creek water in late summer, dark and clear and moving with thought. She was not a fragile woman. She looked like she had been built for weather. "I have been nothing but polite," she said, which was not entirely true but was not entirely untrue either. You threatened him, Ralph pointed out. He's a mule, he doesn't understand threats. He understood yours well enough to consider them. He just didn't respect them. Ralph paused. He needs to know you mean it, not that you're angry. There's a difference. Virginia Crawford looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Then she turned and finished hitching the mule to the wagon with capable, practiced hands, and she did it in silence, which he found he did not mind. Virginia Crawford, she said when she was done, not looking at him. Ralph Weston, he said. I have the Tibbet place. She did look at him then, something shifting in those eyes. I know the Tibbet place, she said. My father's land runs along the north fence line. Crawford, Ralph said, turning the name over. Your father is James Crawford. Was, she said, and the single word carried a weight that ended that line of conversation as decisively as a door closing. I run the spread now. My brother Eli and I, she gathered her reins. The north fence line needs mending in 2 places. In case you hadn't noticed. I had noticed, Ralph said. I was going to get to it. That would be appreciated, she said, and clicked her tongue at the mule and drove away without looking back. And Ralph Weston stood in the middle of the Coulter's Creek Main Street with flour and nails, and the distinct, disorienting feeling that the world had just arranged itself differently than it had been 5 minutes ago. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this repeatedly over the following weeks, with the kind of determination that, if he had been more honest with himself, he would have recognized as proof of exactly the opposite. The Crawford spread sat to the north of Ralph's land, separated by a cedar fence that did indeed need mending, and also by a dry creek bed that ran hard in the brief rainy season, and was otherwise a gentle suggestion of water. Virginia ran about 80 acres with her younger brother Eli, who was 20 and as tall as a fence post and about as talkative, and a hired man named Cutter Downs who had come from somewhere nobody asked about and who cooked better than any man Ralph had ever met and seemed to regard this talent as mildly embarrassing. Ralph mended the fence. He spent the better part of 2 days on it, working from his side, careful not to cross the line without reason. He pulled old wire, reset leaning posts, drove new ones where the cedar had rotted through. It was honest, physical work, and he was good at it. On the second afternoon, he became aware that he was being observed, and he turned to find Virginia Crawford sitting on horseback some 20 yards away on her side of the fence, watching him with that same unreadable expression she had used on him in town. "You do good work," she said. "Thank you. My father always said a man who could set a straight fence post had his head on straight." Ralph looked down the line of posts he'd set. They were straight. He was quietly proud of this. "Your father sounds like he was a practical man," Ralph said. "He was," Virginia said. "He died last October, fever." She said it plainly, the way you say hard things when you have said them enough times that they have become facts rather than wounds, though Ralph suspected the wound was still there, just learned to be carried. "I'm sorry," Ralph said. "He liked the land," Virginia said, looking out over the mesquite and the pale grass. "He said land doesn't break promises, people break promises. Land just is." Ralph considered this. "That sounds about right," he said. Virginia nodded once, satisfied, and turned her horse and rode back toward her house, and Ralph watched her go and then went back to his fence posts, and said nothing to nobody about the way the afternoon light had caught the dark of her hair when she turned. He noticed everything about her in those early weeks, the way you notice the details of a landscape you already know you are going to live in. He noticed that she rode with the easy authority of someone who had grown up on a horse and had never had occasion to be afraid of one. He noticed that she was at the fence line most mornings checking her stock before sunrise, that she made decisions quickly and without second-guessing, that she spoke to her animals with the same directness she used with people. No baby talk, no theatrics, just clear expectation. He noticed that she laughed rarely, but when she did, it was without reservation, a full and genuine thing that sounded like it surprised even her. He noticed that she was alone in a particular way, not lonely exactly, but self-contained, like someone who had learned very early that depending on others was a luxury the land could not always afford. He did not speak of any of this. It was not his way. Ralph Weston had spent most of his life as a man of action rather than declaration. He built things. He fixed things. He worked until his hands were calloused and his back was stiff, and the sun was too far gone to work by, and then he sat on his porch in the dark and thought his thoughts in private. It was one of those evenings in late April, a Thursday, he thought, though he had been losing track of days in the way men do when they live by season rather than calendar, that he found himself sitting on his porch with a piece of hardwood in his lap and his pocket-knife in his hand, and not thinking about anything in particular, and then thinking about one thing in particular without quite meaning to, and then carving. He had not planned it. He was not even sure when it became intentional. His hands knew the knife and the wood the way his hands knew a bridle or a fence post, and he was not watching them closely because he was watching the moon come up over the mesquite. And by the time he looked down at what he had made something he had not consciously decided to make. He had carved her name, not into a piece of wood to show anyone. He had carved it into the cedar gatepost at the entrance to his land, the one that stood at the joining of the two fence lines, the one that was visible from the Crawford property. He had not planned to do it there. He had been sitting by the post in the cooling evening, his back against the cedar, watching the stars come out, and his hands had moved, and Virginia Crawford's name was now part of the wood as surely as the rings inside it. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he stood up, brushed cedar shavings from his trousers, and walked back to his house without looking at what he'd done again, as though not acknowledging it could unmake it. But it could not be unmade. The letters were clean and precise, the way he did everything, no wasted effort, no hesitation in the cuts. Virginia, just her given name, not her family name, just the part of her name that was only hers. He lay awake that night in a state of extreme discomfort that he refused to call what it was. In the morning, he went about his work and did not go near the gatepost, and the day after that he did the same, and the day after that, and he told himself it didn't matter because nobody went near that post except him. The gate was rarely used. The main road into his property came from the other direction. There was no reason for anyone to see it. On the fourth day, he saw Virginia riding along her fence line in the early morning, and he watched her slow her horse as she reached the section near the post, and he watched her look at it, and he felt something in his chest that was approximately the physical sensation of falling from a height. She sat on her horse and looked at the post for what seemed to Ralph, watching from a distance he hoped was great enough to be invisible, an extremely long time. Then she rode on without stopping, without turning to look toward his property, without any visible change in her expression or her pace, and she disappeared into the trees along the dry creek line, and that was that. Ralph spent the rest of the day building a chicken coop he had been meaning to build for 3 months and had not previously had sufficient motivation to begin. She said nothing, not that day, nor the next, nor the one after that. A week passed in which Ralph and Virginia saw each other twice in passing. Once when she rode past his property while he was working in his field and raised a hand in greeting. Once when they were both at the general store at the same time and exchanged 4 civil words about the possibility of late rain. And neither of those encounters contained a single reference to carved wood, or gateposts or names or anything that might be interpreted as a woman, acknowledging that she had seen the inside of a man's unexpressed heart pinned to a cedar post at the edge of his property. Ralph could not decide if this was better or worse than being confronted about it. He concluded it was worse, in the way that uncertainty is always worse than known outcomes, even poor ones. He went back to the gatepost on the 8th day, fully intending to sand the letters down, to erase the evidence of the impulse, to restore the post to the anonymous anonymity of all good cedar fence posts, and he stood there with a piece of rough sandstone in his hand for a full 10 minutes and could not bring himself to do it. He put the sandstone in his pocket and went home. On the 10th day, Virginia Crawford rode up to his front gate and called his name. He came out of the barn where he had been working with his good mare, a dark bay he called Patience, and he walked to the fence with his hat in his hand because he had pulled it off when he heard her voice and had not thought to put it back, and he stood there looking up at her in the afternoon light and waited. She was carrying something. A cast iron pot with a cloth tied over the top, hanging from her saddle horn by a hook, the way women carried food when they were going somewhere. "Cutter made too much stew," she said, lifting the pot and holding it out toward him. "He always makes too much. You might as well have it." Ralph took the pot. It was warm and heavy and smelled extraordinary. "That's very kind," he said. "He made biscuits too," Virginia said, pulling a wrapped bundle from her saddlebag and handing it down. "They're better hot, but they're decent cold." "Thank you," Ralph said. He held the food and looked up at her. She was looking at a point somewhere past his left shoulder which he had begun to understand was something she did when she was thinking carefully about words. "You have good land," she said finally, "for what it is." "It's better than it looks," Ralph agreed. "Most things are," Virginia said. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of remarkable thing. "I appreciate the meal," Ralph said. "Don't mention it," Virginia said, which in his experience was the kind of thing people said when they meant both "don't thank me" and also "don't speak further on this topic." And he honored that. And she turned her horse and rode back toward her property. And he stood holding stew and biscuits in the warm evening air and felt something complicated and warm unspooling in his chest. He ate at his table alone that night, and the stew was the finest thing he had tasted in 6 months, and he thought about nothing in particular while he ate it, which meant he thought about one thing entirely, quietly, without giving it words. The biscuits were, as promised, excellent even cold. The next 2 weeks brought work that would have overwhelmed a man with less stamina. Ralph was breaking new ground on the South Quarter, and the soil there was bound with caliche that fought every shovel stroke like it had personal grievances. He was also dealing with an ongoing drama involving his neighbor to the east, a sour-tempered older man named Birch Calloway, who had twice let his cattle drift through Ralph's fence onto his land, and had responded to both complaints with the particular combination of dismissal and belligerence that suggested he was testing the patience of the new man to see what would happen. What happened was that Ralph mended the fence the first time without comment, mended it the second time with a polite but very direct conversation that included a specific description of his legal rights under Texas property law, and prepared himself for a third incident with the resigned patience of a man who understood that some problems had to be weathered more than once before they resolved. The third incident never came, which Ralph credited to either the clarity of his legal description or the fact that he was plainly not a man who would fold under pressure, and Calloway had the calculating instinct of a bully who chose his battles by available leverage. It was during this period that he had his first real, extended conversation with Virginia Crawford. She appeared one afternoon at his fence line while he was wrestling with a particularly stubborn section of caliche, and she was leading 2 horses, including her own, and she called across the fence with the directness he had come to associate with her. "You're breaking that ground wrong," she said. Ralph straightened up and looked at her with the expression of a man who was very tired and was making a significant effort to be receptive rather than proud about it. "Is that right?" he said. "You're going at it straight on. You need to come at it from the side, break the lip of it and work under. Otherwise you're just pushing it around." She paused. "My father figured that out his second year. Spent the whole first year fighting it the way you're fighting it." Ralph looked down at the caliche he had been fighting for 3 days. He looked back at Virginia. He said, "Show me." She tied her horse to the fence, climbed through it with a practicality that suggested she had been climbing through fences her entire life, took the shovel from his hand and demonstrated. She was right. Caliche broke differently when you came at it from the angle, when you worked under its lip rather than against its face, and in 15 minutes she had done what would have taken him another hour of his current method. "Thank you," Ralph said, watching her work. "Don't waste effort," she said. "This land doesn't forgive wasted effort." "Your father teach you that too?" "Some of it. Some I learned myself." She handed him back the shovel and looked out across his south quarter. "You're ambitious with this place. 40 acres and a one-man operation. I'll hire when I can afford it. What are you running? Cattle?" "Cattle and horses. I want to run horses primarily. Break and sell maybe some breeding stock eventually." Something changed in her expression, not quite softening but opening like a window pushed up on a warm day. "Horses," she said. "Your father run cattle." "Cattle and horses," she said, and there was something almost like a smile in the corner of her mouth. "He loved the horses more. So do I." "What breed?" Ralph asked. And then they were talking, really talking. The way people talk when they have found a subject that matters to both of them. The words coming with the ease of water finding its level. She knew horses the way she knew weather, thoroughly and without sentiment, with the deep practical love of a person who had grown up depending on them. She talked about bloodlines and temperament, and the difference between a horse trained with patience and one trained with fear. And Ralph listened with the focused attention of a man who was interested in every word and also in the way she spoke them. The animation in her face, the certainty in her opinions, the brief moments when something she said surprised even herself, and she paused and considered it before going on. They talked until the afternoon had gone cool around them and the light was slanting long and golden across the grass. And then Virginia looked at the sky with the weather-reading habit of a rancher and said, "I should get back." "I'll walk you to your horse," Ralph said. He did, and she climbed through the fence again with the same easy capability, and she was on her horse and gathering her reins when she looked at him in a way that was direct and clear, the way she looked at everything. "The stew was not Cutter's idea," she said. She said nothing else. She rode away. Ralph stood at his fence line in the golden late daylight, and he felt the words settle into him like rain into dry ground, and he thought, well then, Coulter's Creek had its rhythms, and May fell into them with the particular mix of industry and social life that frontier towns managed despite, or perhaps because of, their isolation. There was a church social on the third Sunday of the month, organized by Reverend Halliday's wife, Margaret, who was the kind of woman who organized things the way other people breathed. There was a quarterly cattle meeting at the saloon The Broken Spoke, where ranchers compared notes and occasionally argued about water rights with enough passion to make the barkeep nervous. There were the daily commerce of the general store, the livery, and the blacksmiths, and the informal gathering of men on the porch of the store in the late afternoon, and the separate, more complicated social geography of the women of the town, who operated with less visibility and considerably more effect. Virginia Crawford was not a social creature in the way the town might have wished. She attended church on Sundays. She came to town for necessary business. She was polite and capable in all interactions, and kept her personal life behind a fence that was considerably more reliable than the one she ran cattle against. She was known in Coulter's Creek as a capable woman who had stepped up after her father's death, respected and perhaps slightly admired, and also given the wide berth that independent women often received in small frontier towns, where the unspoken expectation was that a woman running property was a temporary arrangement pending the arrival of a husband to do it properly. Virginia appeared to be entirely untroubled by this expectation and entirely uninterested in fulfilling it, which was its own kind of reputation. Ralph went to the church social in May because it was the kind of thing a man went to if he wanted to be considered a member of a community rather than a hermit on its edges. He wore his good shirt and his good hat and ate Margaret Halliday's exceptional corn, pudding, and spoke with Cutter Downs about the spring cattle prices, and with Eli Crawford about nothing in particular, because Eli Crawford could hold a civil conversation about nothing in particular with genuine commitment. Virginia was there. She was wearing a dark blue dress he had not seen before, and her hair was up in a way that was different from her working style, not fancier, exactly, but more deliberate, as though she had taken time with it rather than simply securing it out of her face. She was talking to a woman he knew slightly as Ada Marsh, the wife of the schoolteacher, and she was not looking in his direction, which he was reasonably certain was intentional. He ate his corn pudding and talked to people, and worked his way toward her by the method of talking to everyone in the room except her, which was not as subtle as he believed, but was polite enough to pass. He ended up in a cluster near the lemonade table that included Virginia, Ada Marsh, Reverend Halliday, and a merchant from up north called Amos Green, who was in town for the cattle prices, and who had the effusive sociability of a man who sold things for a living. Amos Green was telling a story about Kansas City and requiring very little encouragement to continue. Virginia was listening with the expression of a woman who is present in body and elsewhere in mind, and when she shifted her gaze from Amos Green's story to find Ralph standing 2 feet away, something moved across her face so quickly he almost missed it. "Mr. Weston," she said. "Miss Crawford," he said. Amos Green, unaware of any subtext, immediately incorporated Ralph into his story about Kansas City, and they were both temporarily absorbed into it, standing side by side against the lemonade table. And when the story had run its natural course and the group had redistributed itself in the way groups do, Ralph said quietly, for her ear alone, "Blue suits you." Virginia looked straight ahead and took a sip of her lemonade. "I know that," she said. Ralph looked straight ahead as well and tried not to smile. "I didn't doubt it," he said. "How is the caliche coming?" she said. "Better," he said. "I broke the south quarter. 2 days your method." "Good," she said. "I have 3 young mares I'm starting under saddle," he said. "You're welcome to see them any time." She was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She came at first light, before the heat had a chance to establish itself, wearing her working clothes and her working expression, and she spent 2 hours with him in his corral watching him work the young mares one at a time. And she said very little, but what she said was precise and useful. And when he brought the second mare around for a second pass, she stepped into the corral and took the lead line from him and worked the horse herself, easy and confident. And the mare responded to her with the immediate trust that horses sometimes grant to certain people as an unearned gift. Ralph watched her work and felt something in him settle and also complicate at the same time, which was a combination of feelings he had not previously encountered and could not name. "She's a good one," Virginia said, bringing the mare to a stop beside him. "She's going to be something when she's finished." "I think so too," Ralph said. He was looking at Virginia, not the horse. She looked at him. She held his gaze for a full 3 seconds, which was longer than she usually managed with him, and he thought he saw something in her expression that was working towards something, some word or decision. And then she handed him the lead line and said, "I should get back." "Eli's pulling teeth today." "Pulling teeth," Ralph repeated. "He's building a new section of hay barn by himself, and he's convinced he can do it in 1 day. He cannot do it in 1 day. I need to be there to tell him this repeatedly." "Do you want help?" Ralph said. Virginia Crawford blinked at him. It was almost the first time he had seen her visibly surprised by anything. "It's a barn," she said. "I know what a barn is," Ralph said. She studied him with those clear eyes for a long moment. "We can't pay you," she said. "I know," he said, another long moment. "All right," she said. "But Eli gets the credit. He'll accept help better if he thinks it was his idea." "I'll follow his lead," Ralph said. They went to the Crawford place, and Virginia was right about Eli, who had laid out plans for the barn section that were ambitious by half, but whose eyes lit up when Ralph appeared and offered to help, as though the whole enterprise had just been redeemed from folly. They worked through the heat of the day. The 3 of them Cutter joined in after noon, providing periodic sandwiches and regular commentary. And by 4 o'clock they had the frame standing and the first wall boards nailed. Eli Crawford was a good worker, Ralph discovered. Quiet, as Virginia was quiet but not with the same complexity. Eli's quiet was simpler, a young man still growing into himself, not yet sure what he thought about most things, working it out through his hands. He was clearly devoted to his sister in the way of siblings who have come through a hard thing together and understand what the other one is worth. They ate dinner at the Crawford table that evening, stew again, which Ralph suspected Cutter made as a default when required to cook without warning, but which was again extraordinary. The house was modest and well kept, with touches that spoke of the people who lived in it. A shelf of books that had been read and reread, a carefully mended rag rug, a framed photograph of a family that Ralph did not look at too long because it felt like private territory. Virginia sat across from him at the table and talked to Eli about the barn, and sometimes she talked to Ralph about the horses, and once she looked at him in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, and the sentence trailed off and she found it again and finished it, and Ralph ate his stew and thought, "Tomorrow I am going to say something." He did not say anything tomorrow. He rode home that evening and spent 3 days being extremely industrious about every other aspect of his life, while conducting an internal argument with himself about what he wanted, and whether it was the kind of thing a man in his position, new land, uncertain prospects, neighbor, had any business wanting. The argument resolved in the way most of his arguments with himself resolved, which was that his practical considerations made a thorough and reasonable case, and his stubborn heart entirely ignored it. He was at her gate on a Saturday morning in early June. She came out when he knocked, wiping her hands on a cloth, a small smudge of something on her cheek that she was unaware of. He removed his hat. "I want to take you riding," he said. Virginia looked at him. "Riding," she said, "along the creek bed. There's a section I found in the spring about 2 miles north. It's worth seeing." She looked at him for the kind of time that told him she was making a decision. Then she said, "Give me 10 minutes." She was back in 8, hat on, horse saddled, and she gave the horse's girth one last check with the practiced hand of a person who trusted their work but verified it anyway. And then she mounted and looked at him with that open, careful expression and said, "Lead on then." They rode north along the creek bed in the easy quiet of people who had found that they did not need noise between them. The Texas morning was still cool, the mesquite casting its thin shade, the creek running with more water than usual from recent rains, and making its low, constant voice over the limestone. Ralph had been along this stretch a dozen times since he'd found it, but it was different with someone beside him, the way most things are different with company you value. The section he had meant to show her was a wide natural clearing, where the creek bent and the far bank rose to a limestone shelf, and the water pooled in a broad, clear shallows before it picked up speed again. Someone sometime had planted a pecan tree on the bank, and it had grown to a size that suggested it had been there longer than any living memory in Coulter's Creek. The morning light came through its new leaves in a shifting green-gold pattern that was genuinely beautiful, the kind of thing that required no improvement. Virginia stopped her horse and looked at it for a long time. "I didn't know this was here," she said. "Your land runs close by," Ralph said, "maybe 200 yards east. Eli and I used to come along the creek when we were young, but we always turned back at the bend." She looked at the tree, the water, the light. "Papa would have loved this." Ralph said nothing because there was nothing useful to say about that, and he was a man who understood the difference between filling a silence and respecting it. They sat on the creek bank after a while, horses ground-tied in the grass, and Virginia took off her hat and turned it in her hands, and they talked in the way that had become natural between them. About the land, about the horses, about the season, and what it meant for the coming year. Virginia talked about her plans for the Crawford property, specific and considered, with the long view of someone who intended to still be there in 20 years. She wanted to build up the horse stock, improve the grazing land, perhaps add a second well on the north end. "You sound like you've been thinking about this a long time," Ralph said. "Since I was about 12, Virginia said. When it was clear Eli wasn't going to be the planner and Papa needed one, she said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Somebody had to think ahead, and you were good at it. I had to be, she said. Good and had to be are sometimes the same thing. She looked at him sideways. What about you? What are you planning? Ralph thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and gave it. He talked about the horse operation, the breeding stock he eventually wanted, a proper stable and round pen, eventually enough income to hire help and run the place without it depending entirely on his singular presence. He talked about it the way he thought about it, which was as a long project, something being built over years, not a thing to be completed quickly. You're building something real, Virginia said. Trying to, Ralph said. Most men who come through here are passing through, she said. I can always tell. They treat the land like it's temporary, like it's just a place to be until the next place. You don't do that. This is my place, Ralph said simply. I'm not going anywhere. Virginia looked at the pecan tree and the water and the morning light. Then she looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was new, something that had come through the reserve and the self-containment like a root pushing through caliche, and she said quietly, I found your Gatepost. Ralph held her gaze. I know, he said. It's been there a good while, she said. About 6 weeks, he agreed. You carved it before you ever said my name to me, she said. Before we talked about horses or fences or anything. The first time I saw you in the street with that mule, Ralph said, I knew there was going to be trouble. Trouble, Virginia said. For me, Ralph clarified, the kind of trouble you don't mind having. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a directness that was wholly her own, I am not an easy woman, Ralph Weston. I know that, he said. I have a property to run and a brother to watch out for, and I have made a perfectly adequate life, and I have not been looking for someone to complicate it. I understand, he said. I am telling you this, she said, because you should know what you're dealing with before you go carving any more names into posts. Ralph looked at her with those steady gray eyes. I already know what I'm dealing with, he said. I've been watching you work for 2 months. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I would like your permission to court you properly if you're willing. Virginia Crawford put her hat back on. She looked at the pecan tree. She looked at the water. She looked at the light through the new leaves. She looked at Ralph Weston. I suppose I am willing, she said, with the particular combination of dignity and suppressed emotion that he would come to think of as one of the most beautiful things about her. They rode back along the creek bed in a different kind of quiet than they had come in, and when they parted at her gate, he held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and then she said, Come to dinner on Wednesday, and went in without looking back, and Ralph rode home across his own land with the particular joy of a man who has won something that required winning. The courting of Virginia Crawford was conducted with the same directness and practical honesty that characterized everything she did, and Ralph would not have had it any other way. There were no elaborate gestures, no exaggerated declarations. What there was time spent together writing, working, sitting on the porch of her house in the evenings while Eli whittled and Cutter played his harmonica badly, and the night came in from the west. There were conversations that lasted past midnight about things that mattered and things that didn't, the way conversations go when two people are discovering that the other person is vast enough to spend hours in without reaching the walls. There were small touches, her hand on his arm when she wanted to show him something, his hand at her back when they walked, nothing forward, nothing that exceeded the understood decorum of their time and place, but the warmth of them accumulated like sunlight on stone, slow and constant, and eventually impossible to deny. By July, the town had formed its opinion, as small towns always do. Margaret Halliday thought it was wonderful and said so to everyone. Amos Green, who had returned to town for the summer cattle trade, thought Virginia could do better and said so to nobody who would listen seriously. Eli Crawford, when Ralph asked him very correctly for a private word one evening in early July and explained his intentions and asked for Eli's blessing as the nearest male relative, went very still and then said, after a long pause, She's stubborn as that gray mule. And Ralph said, I know. And Eli said, and you still want to. And Ralph said, more than anything I can think of. And Eli considered this for what felt like an extended geological period, and then stuck out his hand and shook Ralph's and said, all right then, and went back to his whittling. There was one difficult stretch in late July that could have gone differently. A man rode into Coulter's Creek called Denton Reese, who had known Virginia Crawford some years prior, and who returned to town with a horse trader's business and a particular interest in the Crawford property that went beyond casual. He was a presentable man of about 30, easy with words in the way that salesmen are, and he called on Virginia twice in a single week, which the town noted and discussed thoroughly. Ralph heard about this from Cutter, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man who was being informative rather than inflammatory. Ralph said, thank you, and went about his work, and felt something cold and steady in his chest that he recognized as a choice presenting itself. He could say something. He could do something. He could make his claim explicit in ways that the frontier permitted if not encouraged, and part of him wanted to, the ancient and unreasoning part that did not always share his other qualities of patience and restraint. He did none of those things. He trusted Virginia Crawford. What he did do was come to her property on the second Thursday of the month, as he always did, and sit on her porch and help her figure out the season's accounts, which she was better at than him, but which had grown complicated enough that a second set of eyes was useful. And he said nothing about Denton Reese because it was not his business to say anything. Virginia, for her part, said nothing about Denton Reese either until they had finished the accounts and were sitting in the cooling evening, and she said, without preamble, Denton Reese came by. So I heard, Ralph said. He made an offer on the property, she said. Fair price, actually, more than fair. Ralph was quiet. I told him no, Virginia said. I told him this land is not for sale, and it will not be for sale, and any man who comes back with another offer will find himself turned around at the gate. She paused. He also suggested that a woman running property alone might want to reconsider her situation. He said that, Ralph said, and something in his tone was very quiet and also very final. He did, Virginia said. And I explained to him very clearly that my situation was not alone and was not any of his concern. She looked at Ralph. I told him I was being courted by a man whose judgment I trust and whose intentions I respect and who had better things to do than come around making offers that weren't wanted. Ralph looked at her. You said that to him. I said something close to that, Virginia said, with the ghost of something in her expression that might, on a different woman, have been called mischief. And what did he say? Ralph asked. He said he hoped I hadn't made a mistake, Virginia said. And I said I don't generally make mistakes because I take my time and think things through. She held Ralph's gaze steadily. And I have taken my time, she said, and I have thought it through. Ralph set down his cup. He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who was as constant as the land she loved and as direct as the sky over it, and he said, Virginia. Ralph, she said. I would like to marry you, he said, if you'll have me. Virginia Crawford looked at him for a long, steady moment, the kind of moment that contains a great deal of weather. And then she said, I believe I will, and the smile that came with it was the full and genuine one, the one that surprised her, and it was the most beautiful thing Ralph Weston had ever seen. They were married on a Saturday morning in late September of 1878, in Reverend Halliday's church, which smelled of wood polish and candle wax, and the wildflowers that Margaret Halliday had contributed in sufficient volume to suggest an opinion about the importance of the event. Virginia wore a dress she had made herself from good cream-colored cotton, with a row of small buttons that she had ordered from the catalog, and which had arrived just in time. And she carried a bunch of the late-season wildflowers that grew along the creek, yellow and white, and a deep rust red that the land offered in September like a last generous gift before winter. Ralph wore his good suit, which he had pressed at the laundry for the first time in its history, and his good hat, and he stood at the altar with Eli Crawford at his side because, when he'd asked Eli to stand with him, Eli had looked at him with those quiet eyes and said simply, "I was hoping you'd ask," which was the longest sentimental speech Ralph had ever heard from Eli Crawford, and which he treasured accordingly. Virginia walked down the aisle of the church alone, because there was no one to give her away in the traditional sense, and because she had remarked privately to Ralph that she was not a thing to be given. She was a person making a choice, and Reverend Halliday, who was a flexible man within the constraints of his calling, had accommodated this perspective without difficulty. She walked down the aisle of the church and looked at Ralph at the end of it, and Ralph looked at her, and there was a moment before she reached him when their eyes met, and the whole simple, enormous weight of what they were about to do was in the air between them, and it was clean and honest and certain, the way the land is certain, without sentiment but not without feeling. "Do you take this man?" Reverend Halliday said. "I do," Virginia said, and meant it in the bone. "Do you take this woman?" Reverend Halliday said. "I do," Ralph said, and the words were steady and sure and as final as a fence post set in concrete, and he meant them the same way. They had their wedding dinner at the Crawford house. Their house now, they had decided together that it made more practical sense, the Crawford property being better established, Ralph moving his stock and his Cedar End limestone possessions over the month before, and Cutter made a dinner that had clearly involved planning and genuine emotional investment, 3 courses and a cake that was slightly lopsided and entirely excellent. Eli made a speech that consisted of 7 words, "I am glad you chose each other," and sat down with the expression of a man who had given everything he had. Margaret Halliday cried. Reverend Halliday looked pleased. Several members of the town drifted in and out across the afternoon, in the way that people do when a celebration is occurring, and they want to be near its warmth. That night, when the visitors had gone and Eli had gone quietly to his room and Cutter had cleaned the kitchen, and disappeared to the bunkhouse with the tactful discretion of a man who understood his place in the household that was now being formed, Ralph and Virginia sat on the porch of their house together for the first time as married people, in the dark and the quiet and the great Texas night with its stars overhead. And Virginia leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there for a long while saying nothing, and it was the most comfortable silence Ralph Weston had ever inhabited. "I want to move the gatepost," Virginia said eventually. Ralph looked down at her. "The gatepost," he said. "The one at the property line. If we're combining operations, it should be moved back. We'll want a wider entrance." She paused. "But I want to keep the cedar from the old post. I want to use it for something." Ralph thought about this. "What did you have in mind?" he said. Virginia was quiet for a moment. "A shelf," she said. "For the house, something useful." She looked up at him in the dark. "With your carving on it." Ralph held her gaze for a moment in the starlight, and then he bent his head and kissed her hair, and she turned her face up to him, and the night was warm and full of the sound of the creek and the horses in the pasture, and the ordinary miraculous sounds of a life that was being built. The autumn of 1878 brought the merger of the 2 properties in the practical sense. The fence line between them was removed in sections as they expanded their combined pasture. The old gatepost was taken down with a solemnity that Ralph did not acknowledge, and Virginia pretended not to notice. The operations of both properties consolidated under a single ledger that Virginia kept with her characteristic precision, and Ralph contributed to with his characteristic industry. They worked together well, better than either of them had expected, perhaps, though neither of them said this because it would have implied they'd had doubts they hadn't quite had. They disagreed sometimes about the timing of decisions, the management of the horses, a particular fence line that Ralph wanted to pull and Virginia wanted to keep. And they disagreed the way they did everything else, directly and without drama, and they generally reached a conclusion that was better than either of their separate starting positions, which Ralph thought was the most useful thing about having a partner. Eli was a constant and comfortable presence, working hard and saying little and occasionally saying exactly the right thing at the right moment in the way of people who conserve words and spend them well. Cutter stayed on, as they had both hoped he would, and fed them all better than they deserved, and maintained the particular useful fiction that the bunkhouse was a separate social world from the main house, which meant that domestic life retained its privacy and working life retained its proper structure. The winter of 1878 was harder than expected. December brought a freeze that came in fast and stayed long, killing the last of the fall grass and threatening the stock with cold they were not fully prepared for. Ralph and Eli worked through 2 nights without meaningful sleep, keeping fires going in the barn, breaking ice in the water troughs, moving vulnerable animals into shelter. Virginia worked alongside them, not deferring to Ralph because he was her husband, not being deferred to because it was her family land, just working as a partner in the way she had always worked, without ceremony, without hesitation, without any of the self-consciousness that might have come with a newer relationship. On the second frozen night, somewhere around 3 in the morning, with ice on the ground and ice on their breath, and the fire in the barn casting its orange light on the horses standing close and patient, Virginia leaned against the stable wall beside Ralph, and he put his arm around her, and she said nothing, but she put her cold hand over his and held it there. And he thought about the gatepost and the name he had carved before he'd ever said it aloud, and the shelf it had become, and the life that had grown from it, and he felt a gratitude that had no adequate language. The thaw came in February, gradual and merciful, and with it came a spring that was better than the year before: more rain, early grass, good conditions for the foals they were expecting from 2 of the mares they'd bred in the fall. Ralph had been expanding the horse operation steadily, buying and breaking young stock, developing a reputation in the county for horses that were well-trained and reliably tempered, which was more commercially valuable than raw speed, and the county was beginning to understand this. It was in the late spring of 1879 that Virginia told Ralph she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning, before breakfast, in the kitchen, with the matter-of-fact precision with which she delivered most important information. Ralph set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that he was not fully in control of, which was unusual for him, and she looked back at him with an expression that was also not fully controlled, which was unusual for her, and for a moment they were simply 2 people looking at each other across the recognition of something enormous and ordinary and beautiful. "When?" he said. "December, I think. Maybe January." Ralph came around the table and took her face in his hands and kissed her very carefully, the way you treat something that is precious and also thoroughly capable of handling itself, and Virginia laughed that full, genuine, surprised laugh and put her hands over his. "You're happy," she said. "I'm more than happy," he said. "I don't have a word for it." "I don't either," she said. Eli, when told, was quiet for a long time and then said, "Pa would have liked that," which was the most emotionally open thing he had said in living memory, and Virginia hugged him hard and briefly, and he submitted to this with the dignity of an endured embrace, and then cleared his throat and said, "I'll need to finish the back room then," which he had been building gradually for the better part of a year, and which now had appropriate urgency. The pregnancy suited Virginia in the sense that she continued to work as she always had, and declined to treat her condition as an illness or an incapacity, which it was not, and Ralph learned quickly that the correct approach was to offer help when it was needed and be available without hovering, which was a calibration that took some weeks to get right, but which, once achieved, worked as well as most of their other working arrangements. Summer of 1879 brought a dispute with Birch Calloway that had been building for months, and finally came to a head over water rights to a section of the creek that both properties bordered. Calloway had been diverting water upstream in a manner that reduced the flow to the Crawford property by a degree that was technically within the law but practically inconvenient, and, in Ralph's assessment, done with intention. Ralph and Virginia rode to Calloway's place together and had a conversation with him that lasted 45 minutes and was conducted at a volume that did not raise above civil, but carried a weight that Calloway, who was a man who understood force when it was presented correctly, ultimately acknowledged. They came away with an agreement about the water that was documented and filed with the county clerk, and Calloway did not test them on it again. And Ralph privately thought that having Virginia in that conversation had made it more effective than he could have managed alone, because she combined the exact knowledge of the legal detail with a manner that suggested she was prepared to pursue this through any available avenue, which she was. "You were remarkable," Ralph said, on the way home. "I was reasonable," Virginia said. "That should not be remarkable." "In Calloway's experience it probably is," Ralph said. Virginia made the expression that was not quite a smile but was close. "He'll be fine," she said. "He just needed to know the boundaries were real." "Like the mule," Ralph said. Virginia looked at him. "You have been waiting a year to say that," she said. "About 8 months," Ralph admitted. She laughed, and the afternoon was bright and warm, and the horses moved easily under them. And Ralph thought this was exactly the kind of thing he wanted every day of his remaining life. This woman beside him, this land around them, this life that they had built from 2 separate enterprises, and a name carved into wood. The autumn of 1879 was golden and long, the kind of Texas autumn that makes you understand why people stayed when they might have gone. Ralph and Virginia moved through it together with the comfortable ease of a year's practice, knowing each other's working rhythms and habits, their short forms and their long thoughts, the way to have disagreements that went somewhere useful, and the way to have conversations at 2 in the morning when neither of them could sleep. Virginia's pregnancy was uncomplicated in the physical sense, though she admitted to Ralph in the late months that she was afraid in ways she had not been afraid of anything for a long time. Not of the birth itself, exactly, but of the possibility of love at that scale, of caring for something that fragile, of having something new to lose. Ralph listened to this with his full attention, which was the thing she valued most in him, and then he said, "You have been afraid before, and you have not let it stop you from doing the important thing." "This is different," she said. "This is not something I can work at and improve." "Sure it is," Ralph said. "Not the birth, but the rest of it. You learn it the same way you learn everything else, by doing it and by being willing to be wrong sometimes and by keeping on." Virginia looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get wise?" she said. "I learned from a woman who knew how to talk to mules," Ralph said. She hit him on the arm, and he caught her hand and held it, and they sat in the lamplight of their house in the big quiet of late autumn and felt the particular, immense peace of people who have found their place. In December of 1879, Virginia delivered a son. He arrived on the 14th of December in the early morning, attended by the midwife from town, a small, fierce woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who had been delivering babies in Coulter's Creek and its surrounding country for 20 years, and who managed the whole event with the brisk competence of someone for whom this was familiar territory, and not, as it was for Ralph, the most astonishing and terrifying thing that had ever happened within 30 feet of him. Ralph was not in the room, because the conventions of the time placed the father elsewhere during birth, but he was outside the closed door of the bedroom for the entire duration of the event, 3.5 hours that felt to him approximately the length of a geological epoch, standing with his back to the wall and his hat in his hands, and listening to sounds he could not interpret with any certainty, and trying to breathe with the steady calm he was applying to this with only partial success. Eli sat with him for the first hour, and then fell asleep in the hall chair with the uncomplicated ease of the young, which Ralph envied. Cutter brought coffee at some point and stood in the hallway for a while without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. When Mrs. Abernathy opened the door and told Ralph he could come in, the look on his face as he crossed the threshold was one that very few people were privileged to see: Ralph Weston, who was steady and contained and deliberate in all things, entirely undone by the sight of his wife holding their son in the lamplight of their room. Virginia looked up at him, and she was tired in every part of her, but her eyes were bright and clear and fully present. And she said, "Come and see him." And Ralph came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very red and very small and was making a sound that sounded like strong personal opinions being developed about the world. And Ralph put out one careful finger, and the baby's hand, which was absurdly tiny, closed around it with a grip of surprising conviction. And something in Ralph's chest broke open in a way that was not painful at all, but was the most significant thing that had ever happened to him. "Hello," he said to his son, very quietly. "James," Virginia said, "after Papa, if you agree." "James," Ralph said, and felt the name settle into the room like it had always been there. "James Weston, that's a good name." "A strong name," Virginia said. "He has a strong grip," Ralph said. "He's going to be stubborn," Virginia said. "He is absolutely going to be stubborn," Ralph agreed. "He comes by it honestly." Virginia looked at him with those clear eyes and the full smile, the one that still surprised her. And Ralph looked back at her, and James held his finger, and the lamp burned low and warm, and the night outside was cold and full of stars, and Coulter's Creek went on sleeping as it always did, unaware that something fundamental had occurred in the back room of the Crawford, the Weston property, or perhaps not unaware, because towns know these things the way land knows seasons. James Weston was a determined and curious child from his first coherent weeks of consciousness, possessed of his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a combination that Mrs. Abernathy later described as potentially formidable and possibly exhausting. He was quiet the way Ralph was quiet, taking things in with those large, considering eyes, and then periodically decisive in ways that caught adults off guard, which seemed to please him. The spring of 1880 brought new horses to the operation, a pair of young stallions that Ralph had found in San Antonio, and which would form the foundation of the breeding program he had been building toward. Virginia's eye for horses proved as valuable in the assessment of breeding stock as it was in everything else, and they made those decisions together, standing in somebody else's corral somewhere, arguing quietly about bloodlines and temperament and conformation with the pleasure of two people who enjoyed disagreeing about things they both cared about. Eli turned 22 that spring and began courting a girl from a homestead east of town, a quiet and competent young woman named Hazel Bowen, who appeared to be one of the few people capable of drawing Eli into actual extended conversation. Ralph liked her immediately. She was straightforward and warm and looked at Eli with the particular look of someone who has found something they did not expect to find. Virginia observed Hazel with her usual careful attention over several months, and then pronounced her excellent, which was about as high a commendation as Virginia Crawford Weston bestowed on anyone, and which Eli received with gratitude and characteristic silence. By the summer of 1880, Coulter's Creek had grown in the way of frontier towns that were settling from wild to established, a new schoolhouse, a second general store, a doctor who was permanent rather than itinerant, and an influx of new families who were building and planting and fencing, and doing all the things that turn raw land into community. The injustices of the frontier were present in this growth, as they were in all such growth. The Comanche and Kiowa peoples, who had lived and hunted across this country for generations, had been pressed further and further back by treaties that were broken as routinely as they were made, and the land that Ralph and Virginia and their neighbors farmed and fenced had been something else entirely before it was theirs. Ralph thought about this sometimes, riding his land in the early morning, thought about what it cost, who had paid it, what was owed that could never adequately be repaid. And he said these things to Virginia, and she received them with the honesty they deserved, and said that the least a person could do was know it and not look away from it. And they agreed on that, as they agreed on most things that mattered. The Crawford Weston horse operation was developing a reputation that extended beyond Coulter's Creek by the fall of 1880. Buyers came from 2 counties over for Ralph's horses, and a rancher from up near Amarillo purchased 3 of the bred mares for a price that made Virginia sit down with the ledger for an hour in quiet satisfaction. They hired a young man named Tomas, who was 20 years old and had come up from South Texas with horse skills and a ready laugh and a work ethic that matched anything Ralph and Virginia could put at him. And the bunkhouse went from containing only Cutter to containing 2 people who made considerable noise and excellent food. James turned 1 year old in December of 1880, a milestone celebrated with quiet family ceremony, a cake from Cutter, a wooden horse carved by Eli, a small pair of boots from his parents that he regarded with the seriousness of someone receiving a significant gift. In the spring of 1881, Eli Crawford married Hazel Bowen in the same church where Ralph and Virginia had married, a ceremony of similar modest dignity and significantly more words from Eli, who had apparently been saving them up. Virginia and Ralph stood together through the ceremony with their son between them, James solemn and observant in his church clothes, and Ralph held Virginia's hand and thought about how different it was to watch a wedding from the inside of a life you had already built with someone, how full it was, how it made the ceremony of it both more ordinary and more sacred. Virginia was expecting their second child by summer. She told Ralph on a June evening on the porch, with James asleep inside and the night warm around them, and Ralph looked at her with the same expression he'd had the first time, the one that was not fully controlled, and she looked at him the same way, and he said, "Are you well?" And she said, "Very well," and he kissed her hand and held it, and that was enough. Their second child was a girl, born in February of 1882, and she arrived with considerably less ceremony than James had, a shorter labor, Mrs. Abernathy even more matter-of-fact, Ralph's vigil outside the door somewhat shorter though no less intense. She was named Clara, after Ralph's mother, who had died some years before and whom he had spoken of enough that Virginia understood this mattered to him deeply. Clara was different from James from the beginning, louder, more immediately communicative, given to expressions of strong preference from her first weeks, which made Virginia laugh and Ralph entirely delighted. James regarded his new sister with the cautious interest of someone encountering a previously hypothetical phenomenon, and slowly, over the following weeks, came to regard her as his personal responsibility, which was a role he assumed with complete seriousness at the age of 2, and which he would maintain in various forms for the rest of their lives. Coulter's Creek in 1882 was a different place from the town Ralph had ridden into 4 years earlier, bigger, more settled, with the beginnings of civic structure, a newspaper, a proper hotel, a telegraph line that had arrived the previous year, and connected them to the wider world with its particular mixture of convenience and anxiety. Ralph and Virginia were part of the fabric of this town in a way that had been built over years, not prominent in the showy sense, but present in the quiet, consistent sense of people who worked hard and kept their word and could be counted on. Ralph had added a proper stable and a round pen to the property by now, and the horse operation was the most successful it had been, with a regular arrangement to supply horses to a cavalry unit at a fort up north, which provided reliable income and a useful scale for the breeding work. Virginia ran the books and the breeding schedule and was, in the county, one of the people you asked about horse bloodlines and horse health, a reputation she had built so gradually and through such consistent reliability that it was entirely unassailable. Eli and Hazel had their own household now in the original Crawford house, which had been separated from the main property at Eli's respectful insistence and Virginia's agreement. Eli wanted his own ground, and this was right and proper, and the families remained close enough that the boundary between the properties was permeable in the way of family boundaries. On a bright October morning in 1882, Ralph rode to the south pasture fence and paused his horse at the place where, 4 years before, the old gatepost had stood. The post was gone, long gone, replaced by a wider gate and a different arrangement. But on the shelf in the kitchen of their house, the shelf Virginia had asked for, made from the cedar of that old post, his carving was still there, Virginia, visible if you looked, integrated into the grain of the wood as though the wood had always meant to say it. He sat on his horse in the fall morning and looked at the land that was his, and not only his, that was theirs in the way everything was theirs. The horses in the pasture, the house with its lit windows, the sound of his daughter somewhere inside it expressing a strong opinion about breakfast, the sound of his son's voice answering in that careful, older-than-his-years way. Virginia was in the stable, he knew, because she was always in the stable at this hour, and the morning light would be on her the way it always was, that clear fall light, and she would be talking to the horses in that direct, no-nonsense way she had, and they would be listening because they always did. He turned his horse back toward the house. He went to the stable first and stood in the doorway, and Virginia was exactly where he knew she would be, working with one of the mares, her hands sure and gentle, and she looked up when he appeared, and her expression was the one he had been watching evolve for 4 years, the one that began with reserve and had been adding layers ever since: warmth, familiarity, that thing she carried for him now that was not easy to name but was entirely unmistakable. "You're standing in the light," she said. He stepped in and leaned against the stall beside her and watched her work for a moment, and then said, "I was thinking about the gatepost." She did not stop her work, but she smiled. "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking about how I carved your name before I ever said it to you," Ralph said, "and I was thinking about how it was possibly the bravest thing I ever did, and also the most reckless, and also how it was absolutely the right thing." Virginia looked at him sidelong. "I know," she said. "You always knew," he said. "I suspected from the moment you helped with that mule," she said. "A man who talks to mules with that kind of patience has his whole heart somewhere." Ralph considered this. "Where did you think it was?" he asked. Virginia paused in her work and turned to look at him fully in the morning light of the stable, with the horses breathing warm around them and the sound of their children inside the house and the land outside going on in its patient, constant way. Her eyes were clear and cert, the color of good creek water, dark and moving with thought. "I knew where it was," she said. "I needed to be sure about mine." "And then," he said, "and then I found your name in the gatepost," she said. "And I said nothing for days because I needed to know it was real." "Was it?" Ralph said. "Everything about you has always been real," Virginia said. "That's what I needed to be sure of." He took her face in his hands, just as he had in the kitchen more than 2 years before, and she put her hands over his just as she had then, and he kissed her in the morning light of the stable while the horses stood quiet, and the day went on around them, steady and full and entirely theirs. The years that followed were good years, the kind that build without your noticing until you look back and see the shape of them. James Weston grew into a boy of remarkable calm and considerable intelligence, who had his mother's gift with horses and his father's gift of stillness, and who seemed to understand from early on that the land was something to be taken seriously. He worked beside his father and his mother and his uncle Eli with the devoted practicality of someone who had been raised to see work as the most honest form of love. Clara Weston was an entirely different kind of person: loud, where James was quiet, demonstrative where he was contained, with a laugh like her mother's that still surprised itself, and a stubbornness that was magnificent to observe from a safe distance. She climbed every fence on the property by the time she was 4, could already sit a horse by 5, and at 6 had appointed herself the primary domestic critic of Cutter's cooking, a role she took with complete seriousness, and which Cutter received with the stoicism of a man who had not entirely anticipated this development in his later years. Eli and Hazel had their own children, a son named James, which led to some confusion at family dinners that nobody minded, and a daughter named Ruth, who was quiet and watchful and followed Virginia around the property like a small, serious shadow whenever she visited. Virginia was an aunt in the way she was everything direct and present and genuinely interested, telling the children true things about the world without softening them more than the children's ages required. And the children accordingly trusted her more than they trusted adults who protected them from everything. Ralph turned 35 in the spring of 1885, and Virginia made him a cake without announcing it would happen, and James and Clara decorated the kitchen with wildflowers they had gathered themselves, and Ralph sat at the table of his life and looked at the people around it, and felt the same thing he had felt holding his son for the first time, that breaking open feeling that was not painful but was the most significant thing a person could feel. "You are looking at things again," Virginia said from across the table. "I'm looking at one thing," Ralph said. "Which is?" she said with that corner-of-the-mouth expression. "Everything that started with a gatepost," he said. Virginia looked at him for a moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his on the tablecloth, in front of the children and the cake and the wildflowers, in the house that had been built from 2 properties and 2 people and years of honest work, and she held it there. "Everything started before the gatepost," she said. "The gatepost was just the first time you were honest about it." "Fair enough," Ralph said. "It usually is," she said. James looked between his parents with his large, considering eyes and said, with the gravity of a 7-year-old presenting a careful observation, "Are you talking about the shelf?" Ralph and Virginia both looked at their son. "What do you know about the shelf?" Ralph said. "It has Mama's name on it," James said. "I asked Mama why and she said it was a story for when I was older. Is it a good story?" Ralph looked at Virginia. Virginia looked at Ralph. "Yes," Ralph said, "it is a very good story." "Will you tell me soon?" James said. "When you find a name you want to carve somewhere," Virginia said, "that will be the right time." James considered this with complete seriousness, and then returned to his cake with the focused attention of a child who has received an answer that requires long-term processing. Clara, who had been waiting for the conversation to reach a conclusion so she could ask a more pressing question, said, "Can I have the biggest piece?" "We'll see," said Virginia. "That means no," Clara told her brother. "It means we'll see," Virginia said. "It means no," Clara said again with conviction. Ralph served his daughter the largest piece of cake and watched her accept it with the dignity of someone who has won a long campaign. And the evening went on, lit and warm and full of the sounds of a family that had been built carefully and loved well and intended to remain. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1888, Ralph Weston stood at the main gate of the property he had built with his wife and his family, the property that was no longer 2 properties or even 1, but something that had grown beyond its original shape: more land, more horses, more years, more life. And he looked out over the mesquite flats and the pale grass and the thin autumn sky, and he felt the weight and the gift of it in equal measure. Virginia came to stand beside him, as she often did at the end of the day, the two of them looking out over the land in the way that people do when the land is genuinely theirs, and they know exactly what it costs to make it so. "The Hallidays are moving to Abilene," she said. "Margaret told me yesterday." "That'll change the social calendar," Ralph said. "It'll change the church," Virginia said. "She has held that congregation together by sheer force of personality for 15 years. She'll hold a different one together in Abilene," Ralph said. "She doesn't know any other way to operate." Virginia smiled. "No," she said, "she doesn't." They were quiet for a moment, watching the evening come in from the west. "James asked me about the shelf again," Virginia said. "He's 10 now. He said he thought he was old enough." "What did you tell him?" Ralph said. "I told him to come find us both and we would tell him together," Virginia said. She looked up at Ralph. "Are you ready to tell it?" Ralph thought about the story, the mule in the middle of the street, the fence line in the spring, the name he had carved in the cool evening without quite meaning to, the 10 days of silence before the stew arrived. He thought about riding to the creek and the pecan tree and the morning light through new leaves, and the question he had asked at the fence line and the answer he had been given, and the morning in the stable when she had told him that everything about him had always been real. "I've been ready for a while," he said. "So have I," Virginia said. They turned toward the house together in the gathering dark, the land spreading out behind them in all directions, the horses in the pasture moving through the dusk with their quiet grace, the light in the windows warm and steady. Behind them the gatepost stood, a newer post, not cedar, not carved, but inside the house the shelf held its word, worn smooth now by years of touch but still legible, still there, the first honest thing and the thing that had started everything. James was waiting on the porch with Clara beside him, because Clara was never not beside him when something important was happening, and he looked at his parents with those considering eyes and said, "You said we could tell the story." "We said we would tell it," Virginia said. "Come inside." They went inside together, the four of them, into the warmth and the lamplight, and Ralph sat down and Virginia sat beside him, and the children settled themselves with the attentiveness of people who understand they are about to receive something real. And Ralph looked at the shelf, and the name carved there, and then at his wife who had found it and said nothing for days because she needed to know it was real. And then he began. "The first time I saw your mother," he said, "she was arguing with a mule, and I knew I was already in trouble." Virginia made the sound that was between a laugh and a protest, and James leaned forward and Clara said, "A mule," with complete delight, and the lamp burned warm, and the story that had made them all that had been built from 2 pieces of adjacent land, and a name carved into cedar, and the slow, sure, patient accumulation of love between 2 people who were honest about everything that mattered went on as stories do, passed from the people who lived it to the people who came from it, into the long golden life that waited on the other side of the night. Outside, the stars came out over Coulter's Creek one by one, the way they always had, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the land was quiet beneath them, and the house held its light against the dark, and Ralph Weston's hand found Virginia's on the table between their children, and she turned it over and held it, and the story went on. It went on for a long time. It went on in the way of good things, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the hard seasons that are part of any honest life, but with the deep, abiding sureness of 2 people who had built something real from the truest materials available to them. It went on in the way that James grew into the land, and Clara grew into her own extraordinary self, and Eli's children ran through the dry creek bed in summer, and Cutter finally taught Tamaz to cook properly, and the horses multiplied, and the operation grew, and the town of Coulter's Creek continued to become what towns become when enough people decide to stay. And on the shelf in the house, in the grain of old cedar, Virginia's name remained, the first word of it, the truest word, the word that had been carved before it was spoken, the word that had been found and held in silence for 10 days while a woman made sure of what she felt, and then answered in every possible way for the rest of the years they were given. Virginia Crawford Weston died at 61 in the spring of 1914, in the house she had lived in most of her life, with her husband beside her and her children and grandchildren near, which was exactly as she had arranged it, because she arranged everything. Ralph sat beside her at the end and held her hand and said her name quietly, the way he had always said it, the way it had been meant when he first carved it, before he had any words for what he meant, when all he had was the knife and the wood and the sure, stubborn, unreasonable knowledge that her name was the most important thing he knew. She looked at him with those clear eyes, still dark and still moving with thought, and she said, "You should have talked to me sooner." "I know," Ralph said. "But the gatepost was good," she said. "The gatepost was good," he agreed. She smiled, the full one, the one that still surprised her even now, and held his hand and was gone. Ralph Weston lived to 74, surrounded by the life she had helped him build, And every morning of those remaining years he put his hand on the shelf where her name was carved, briefly, the way you touch something you depend on to confirm it's still there. And it always was, and the wood was warm under his hand, and he was grateful. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.